Good morning, and thank you all for coming. As Mark said, my name is Patrick Mulvey. These are my parents, Frank and Kathy, and I am here as a representative of the anti-racism team for the church. And I had the honor of working with the Forum Committee to make this event happen today. And as you can see up there, the title of this project is called Mapping Racism and Resistance. And it represents the first effort to comprehensively document and map all racial covenants in Milwaukee County. Their goal is to not only analyze and visualize the historical geographies of racial covenants, but also to uncover Black resistance to discrimination and its impact in shaping racial justice movements today. So we have two presenters here today and members of the project. This is Derek Handley, an assistant professor in the English Department's Public Rhetorics and Community Engagement program. Wow. And he's also an affiliated faculty in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department and affiliated faculty in the Urban Studies program. His research interests are African American rhetoric and literature, Black freedom movement, and rhetorical theory. And then we have Amber Chavez, who's a project fellow and a PhD student in public rhetorics and community engagement program at UW-Milwaukee. She's a graduate teaching assistant in UWM's English department. Her research focuses on access and equity within frameworks of caring. Outside of UWM, she's involved in community and school-based efforts toward racial equity and justice. And, as if that weren't enough, she was once a kindergarten teacher. So, right? All right, so, round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much for coming.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. Ooh, I think my light's going to keep going out up here. Thank you so much for inviting us to this forum. I'm glad to be here to talk to you about the project. George, can we maybe hit like from the beginning for the slides? Yeah. There we go. Talk about the Mapping Racism and Resistance Project. My colleague, Dr. Ann Bonds of the Geography Department, and I founded and co-direct the project. Ann is so sorry she's not able to join us this morning. But like Patrick said, we have one of our prize project fellows, Amber Chavez, who helped me to present this project as well. Next slide. Just to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to give you an overview of the project, what we know so far about racial covenants and how they were used, as well as resistance in Milwaukee County. We'll talk about some maps, and then there will be plenty of times for Q&A. Staying true to my disciplinary roots in the English department, I have a poem up here from Langston Hughes that was written in 1949 about resistance covenants. So this has been, at least within African American literature and African American community, something that we had been aware of. Next slide, please. So I just want to give you all a warning that the language that was used in some of these documents, 20s and 30s, contain racist language. Sometimes, at least for some of my students, it comes to as a shock, but some of you all may remember some of the terms that might have been used, previously to refer to people of color. So again, I just want to give you all a heads up. And next slide, please. And for these next few slides, I'm going to turn it over to Amber.
Good morning, everyone. I'd also, oh, wonderful. You heard I was a kindergarten teacher and you knew just what to do. I want to just start with a big thank you, especially to Patrick for bringing our group in, and to all of you for coming this morning and learning about this important topic. Part of what I'd like to begin with is explaining exactly what a racial covenant is, and talking a little bit about the collaborative mapping process. So restrictive covenants are legally enforceable clauses, and they limit how owners and renters can use a property. We see these restrictive covenants in all types of ways, not necessarily negative, and they are in the deeds of housing. And so they might refer to things such as whether or not you can own livestock on a particular property, or you might have covenants about just different things that you can do with the appearance of the property. But then when it comes to racially restrictive covenants, these are clauses in the deeds that prevent people who are not white from owning the property, but also from occupying or leasing the property. So many of us might be familiar with some of the history around housing segregation that has to do with buying property, but it's important to know that this also has to do with renting property, which really limits the housing stock that people of color were able to access during these times. Yes, so these covenants go with the house. So it also bans the person who currently owns the home from leasing it to someone who is not white, but also to selling it to another homeowner who is not white. That's correct. Excellent point. So when it comes to, as Patrick mentioned, opening, our project is called Mapping Racism and Resistance. And that means that we are part of a comprehensive project to document all of the racially restrictive covenants, as well as the resistance to those covenants. In order to document and then map these, we have to find them. And this is where the collaborative mapping process comes in. How do we find these clauses? And are they difficult to find? Yes, they are. We're working with millions of documents. And first of all, you have to be living in a place where these deeds have been digitized. Luckily, in Milwaukee County, the deeds have been digitized, and it was a years-long process to gain access to them. Once we gained access, we were working with about 1.7 million documents. You can imagine how large of a process this is, and it would be impossible to do by hand. Thankfully, with evolving technology, we were able to use something called optical character recognition. So you hear an optical, you go to the optometrist to get your eyes checked, for example. Character is the letters, recognition, of course, recognizing them. So optical character recognition means that the computer is looking at the letters and looking for certain words that we tell it to flag. Those words are developed from us looking at specific deeds and identifying what kinds of language are in them that would help us know that they're racially restrictive covenants. Now, the computer does a pretty good job of looking at the pictures and identifying potentially restrictive covenants. But of course, even as AI and technology continues to evolve, computers have a hard time putting language into context. That's where our volunteers come in. Once the computer has flagged the documents, and they flagged about 20,000 of those original 1.7 million, then we have volunteers look at each deed and say, yes, this is a racially restrictive covenant, or no, it's not. Now, how might a flagged document not be a racially restrictive covenant? Well, we tell the computer to look for certain words, for example, white. But white might refer instead to Whitefish Bay. Or we might tell the computer to look for the word color. Well, that might refer to the color of paint that you're allowed to use on the house. Remember when I began talking about these restrictive covenants have to do with many details about the housing, not just race. But some of the time, those documents that were flagged are indeed racially restrictive covenants. Well, then we rely on our volunteers to gather really important information from each of those documents, to transcribe or type out the specific language that's used, and then to tell us a little bit about the geographical information. Which lot or block is being referenced? Where does this exist? So then we can take all of that information and put it together in a map. We do this through a program called Zooniverse. Our partners at the University of Minnesota have been able to do a similar project, and we use the technology that they identified so that volunteers can go on their computer, pull up the documents, and look at the different deeds. First they say, yes, this is a racially restrictive covenant or not, and then they identify what that specific language is and add in the geographical data. It's important to note that humans can make mistakes too, right? Not just computers. So we have 5 volunteers look at each document to verify them. Can we go to the next slide? And we do the crowdsourcing for a couple of reasons. First, when those 5 volunteers look at each document, it helps us make sure that the data we have is accurate. We're doing about 200 to 700 transcriptions per day at the height of this project. Of course, 20,000 documents times 5 volunteers means that we have 100,000 documents to review. But more importantly, or perhaps equally importantly, because of course it is important that we have accurate information, but the process is just as important as the product. We're creating these maps for people to learn from, but when it comes to reckoning with the history of Milwaukee County, with the racial history, and with the segregation that still exists today, it's important that people see the language that was actually used, the legal mechanisms, and how that they were enforced through these deeds. Actually looking at the deeds and transcribing them, typing the words out yourself, can be a very emotional process, and it helps us to really sit there and look in the face of the mechanisms that contribute to the maps that we still have in Milwaukee today. It also helps us foster community conversation. Just being a part of this project and learning about it gets us talking about these things and having these conversations with one another. And we think that that is equally as important as the maps that we create. Next slide. We'll go through some more topics today, but I also just want to note that if you want to be a part of this process and join the volunteer effort, we are creating a series of training videos that you can watch from your home and learn how to transcribe the documents yourself. So it's not up on our website just yet, we're still finishing them, but on our website we'll have links to the videos that you can walk through, create a Zooniverse account, learn a little bit about the project, although of course you'll all be experts after today, and then actually pull up the transcriptions and do those steps that I talked about. Identify whether or not it is a racially restrictive covenant, type out the language that's used in those clauses, and then let us know the geographical information. Question, yes? What is crowdsourcing? That is a great question. So crowdsourcing means that our team, there's more than 2 of us on here, but we're a relatively small team, just simply wouldn't be able to go through the 100,000 images that we have to process. So we're asking volunteers or a crowd to help us source the data, that everyone contributes a little bit, and bit by bit we can actually identify where these covenants are and exactly what language is contained in each of them. And then the next slide. To talk about the project updates a little bit and the 3 phases that we have. So this project was really conceptualized beginning around 2017. And then in 2018 began the process of looking for these digitized documents and working with Milwaukee County, not without a little bit of controversy, to gain access to them. And then to begin to transcribe them and begin to create the maps. Recently, so phase 1 is ongoing transcriptions of those racial covenants, as well as the project is called Mapping Racism and Resistance. So while we are mapping the racism that exists in these covenants, we're also digging into the archives and sharing and discovering the Black resistance that was present all along the history of these racial covenants. As we move into phase 2, we recently received a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities called the Digital Advancement Grant. And this is what is allowing us to build a digital platform. It will host all of our data and the maps that we create, as well as these stories of resistance, so that other people can access them. These might be policymakers who want to learn more to be informed. It might be other researchers who are doing additional projects and could use access to this data. But it's also something that just anyone could use, the average layperson. You might want to look up your house to see if there was ever a covenant on your property, or any other use such as that. Phase 3 is coming soon. As we get closer to finishing the transcription process, we're beginning to collect stories and getting ready to interview volunteers and community members about their experiences either with racially restrictive housing or about their experiences being involved in the project. And then our next steps are, of course, beginning to share those stories, and we're even toying with the idea of a possible podcast. So I'll tease that a little bit. And then on the next slide, often a question we get is how far along you are. So this shares a little bit about our progress to date. So far we've had over 6,000 volunteers participate in the verification and transcription process. So when we talk about crowdsourcing, it is a crowd of volunteers who are helping this important project. As I mentioned, there's over 20,000 racial covenants that have been flagged, and we're about 85% of the way through transcribing and verifying those documents. And with that, I'll hand it back over to, oh, a question before I, yes. Yes, so as excited as I am to answer that question, I'll hand it over to Dr. Hanley, who will definitely address that in his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and I promise I will answer all the questions at the end of the presentation, and I will cover that. But first, I just want to say I'm having a proud professor moment. I kind of like wanted Amber to keep going because she's doing such a great job presenting this project that maybe I should just sit back down. Next slide, please. This was given a little preview. I might share what we have so far, but when the project is complete or when the maps are created, as Amber was discussing, you'll be able to click on a property. You'll see the original buyer, the original seller, the location, and then you'll see the racial language that is in the covenant. And some of this, this language are still attached to deeds. So I'll talk a little bit more about the fine tuning of this project at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So what we know so far in doing this research, that the key period of racial covenants in Milwaukee is the 1920s. We see the large influx of this racist language is in the 1920s. We do not know why yet. As Amber said, we have a large data set, and right now we're just recording the information and creating a timeline as well. The other thing we know so far, the racial covenants surround the city of Milwaukee. The most covenant areas are Wauwatosa and the northwest side. We also have to keep in mind that in the 1920s, the borders of Milwaukee looked different than of course, they do now. So then that has to be taken into effect. Next slide. This is the west and the north side of Milwaukee, and you can see through this map, the red is where the covenants that we have identified so far are currently located. And again, at the end, we can take a closer look at that. Next slide, please. please. It's hard to see. Right there is Wauwatosa, and you'll see all the covenants surrounding Wauwatosa. Part of our NEH money, we were able to hire a geographer, and she helped to create the map. And she wanted to put the covenants in red. In the metaphor that she used, she says, the covenants are a wound on the body of Milwaukee. I was just very profound when you're thinking about it. Can we hold the question? Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. And this is towards the south side. We're a little surprised that we're not seeing as many covenants in the south side, but again, we're only 85% complete in the transcribing. We hope to be finished, if not end of the year, then maybe sometime in by early spring. Next slide, please. So the language, what we know, the rhetoric and the language and the targeted groups, primarily whites only, or we'll see a Caucasian and a Caucasian race, exclusion of, quote, colored people or Negroes. We've also seen examples where they were targeting specific ethnic and immigrant groups. I've seen some that said no Italians, which was very surprising. I've seen some that said no Mexicans, as well as a few excluding Jewish people as well. But what has been consistent was the exception for domestic servants. You're okay to be in those spaces as long as you're doing the right job. Next slide. So one of the earliest covenants that we have found was in 1911, and we have maybe up to 100,000 handwritten deeds that we haven't even analyzed yet. So we kind of set those aside, but even in some of the handwritten ones, they have this racial language. First, this land shall never be conveyed to a colored person or alien. Could you hit there we go. So you can see that language handwritten, which to me resonates a little bit more as opposed to something typing kind of seems impersonal, but when you're writing it out, there is a stronger feeling to me. Another early one was in 1919 in restricting the Washington Highlands housing developments. This was land that was formerly owned by Frederick Pabst for a hobby horse farm, but upon his death, his family sought to subdivide and develop the land. So earliest is 1911, and the latest covenant so far, possibly as late as 1960. Several from 1957. Even though they were not enforceable, they were still put in the deeds. Next slide, please. As a person who studies language and thinks about language, I find it fascinating the ways the racial categories were determined. This particular deed to any person of Negro or Ethiopian descent. There was a time when African Americans were referred to as Ethiopian descent, and some in African American literature or poetry, you'll see black people referring to themselves as Ethiopian, because Ethiopian is like the only African nation that is referred to in the Bible. So that Ethiopian identity was embraced. Next slide, please. There are different kinds of covenants, usually included at point of sale or when land was being subdivided or platted. So we see individual covenants, and we see the subdivision-wide covenant. So one covenant might cover a whole bunch of land, which would then be multiple houses. We also see what are called petition covenants. You live in a neighborhood, your house deed doesn't have covenants, but let's say all of us get together and we want to create who can live in our community, then we have a covenant and we all sign it. So we see covenants where you have multiple people who live in that neighborhood have signed it. I think we're up to like 2 or 3 of those so far. This particular, oh, can we go back? This particular covenant here is from, I'm gonna get this name wrong, Zingen and Bronze Ruby Park. No part of said subdivision shall be conveyed or leased to or be occupied by any person other than that of the white race. Servants other than of the white race of an owner or tenant of said premises shall be permitted to occupy said premises while engaged in that capacity. Next slide, please. We've also seen covenants in cemeteries. We've seen it in cemeteries from the cradle to the grave, right? We've seen more cemetery plots than we ever expected. Next slide. This is a covenant from the Graceland Cemetery. Oh, I don't have my reading glasses up here. Let's see. Used solely for the burial of dead bodies of human beings of the white race. Human beings solely of the white race. One of our, when we were given a workshop in a community, one of the persons who was in the workshop says, I believe it's Graceland, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's a very popular cemetery now within the African American community. Next slide. So again, what we see so far is fitting this notion of the iron ring of the suburbs circling around Milwaukee with these racial covenants. Amber had mentioned our partners at University of Minnesota. They did this with both Minnesota and St. Paul. I know in terms of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I know in terms of Minneapolis that we surpassed the number of covenants compared to them. Oh yes, across the country. This is not a Milwaukee phenomena. At one point, early in the 20th century, over half of the houses in which white Americans live were covenant properties. Next slide, please. Again, that's another slide of towards the west of Milwaukee. Next slide. One more. Next slide. So this is a map of Milwaukee's phenomenal suburban expansion in 1926. My colleague is a geographer and she just loves maps. I wish she was here to explain this map. Derek, look at this. This expansion highlights that, that this expansion was premised on suburban home ownership that was inscribed and produced as white. While racial covenants and other discriminatory housing policies have been eliminated and even outlawed, their consequences live on. They remain embedded in property deeds throughout the United States as evidence of the ways in which white supremacy and segregationist systems mapped race on urban development. Working together, they channeled investment into the growing white suburbs and facilitated disinvestment in urban areas occupied by non-white working class communities. Our goal in documenting these racially restricted covenants is not to create another data set accounting for Black loss and deprivation, what Clyde Woods has called a social scientific autopsy, asking, is the patient really dead? Rather, we are working to make visible the ways in which property operates as an essential component of the extractive economies of racial capitalism, even as Black Milwaukeeans and their allies envision, articulated, and built communities of Black livingness, alongside these infrastructures of exclusion. Next slide, please. So it's important, when I met my colleague, Ann Bonds, in January of I think we first met about the project in 2019, and she had already started this process of thinking about this project, mapping racism in Milwaukee County. And I had suggested to her, I said, I think this project needs more. I think we need a little bit more. Because even though it's new to many people now, even today, it was not new to the African Americans living in Milwaukee, especially the local chapter of the NAACP, as well as the Urban League. So it was important that we tell that story as well. How were these covenants resisted? Next slide. For decades, the NAACP led coordinated efforts to outlaw racial covenants and racial discrimination in housing deeds. Part of our project, we analyze and depict Black agency from within the contested space of Milwaukee County in order to reveal the rift, to establish a more complete narrative of the impact of racial covenants. The letter on the slide is from Mr. T.M. Johnson to the mayor, and it represents just one of many municipal leadership demanding attention to the plight facing Black Milwaukeeans confined to the city's 6th ward, where they paid exorbitant rent to live in Milwaukee's oldest and most dilapidated housing stock. And when I'm teaching this to my students, I want them to understand, when you have a limited supply in which you can live, the people who own that property can charge whatever they want. So folks were paying more in rent for worse properties because they had no other place where they could go. Next slide, please. The local fight against rampant racism in housing was also a central focus to the Milwaukee chapter of NAACP, which was founded in 1919. For example, when the Milwaukee Board of Realtors discussed the possibility of establishing a municipally zoned areas for Black residents to live in 1924, which they termed a Black Belt. The local NAACP chapter immediately responded with protests and marches and written condemnation of the idea in the local newspaper. It's worth noting that the Supreme Court had outlawed practices of racial zoning some 7 years prior to 1924. When the Board of Realtors caught wind of the planned actions, they backpedaled and claimed that this was only a rumor. Nonetheless, the NAACP protests proceeded, ensuring that the Realtors' efforts not be swept under the rug as a misunderstanding. Interestingly, these newspaper clippings from the Milwaukee Board of Realtors archive are the only documents in the entirety of the carefully curated archive that mention race or Black people. Given the central role of the Realtors, who were eager to foster segregated neighborhoods and actively encouraged the use of racial covenants toward that end, the absence in the archive speaks volumes. Next slide. Does anybody know who that is? Yes. Upon hearing news about the proposed Black Belt, Wilbur and Artie Halyard, Black American activists who have been working in Beloit, Wisconsin, were compelled to move to Milwaukee and to improve the housing situation for Black Milwaukeeans. In fact, correspondence between the Halyards and Socialist Mayor Daniel Hone, am I pronouncing that right? Hone? Okay. I'm not a Milwaukeean. I'm from Pittsburgh originally. Indicates that the Halyards hope to pursue a model of cooperative housing for Black Milwaukeeans like the Garden Homes Project. However, the mayor declined to support such an endeavor and suggested that the Halyards instead establish a savings and loan, clearly not expecting them to succeed. As Artie Halyard explained in a 1978 interview, quote, "We found it difficult to get a charter. People were not loaning to Black people because they didn't trust them to repay loans. There was a limit to how far north they, meaning Black people, could go, a very narrow space in which they could buy a home, and in that area, no loans were made," end quote. Columbia Savings and Loan was hugely successful and remains open today, one of the few Black savings and loans in the nation to survive the Depression. So again, this is some of the resistance that we're thinking about to the housing discrimination. Next slide, please. The battle against racial covenants also involved efforts to purchase or build homes in areas with racial restrictions. Bernice Lindsay moved to Milwaukee in 1928 from Indiana. She was a trained social worker and founded the Mary Church Terrell Club in 1933, which was a group dedicated to promoting literacy and arts for Black Milwaukeeans. She was deeply concerned about housing shortages in the Black community, particularly for war veterans. In 1932, a local savings and loan was liquidated and sold several properties that were in tax arrears to the city on the northwest edge of Milwaukee in a subdivision called Carlton's Addition. Lindsay, together with 15 other Black individuals, many of whom were members of both the NAACP and the CIO Packing House Workers Union, purchased at least 12 of these lots from the city. The plan was to build housing for African Americans and Black war veterans who would be returning home to a very limited housing. In fact, that packing house employing the workers had agreed to provide financing. Next slide, please. However, Lindsay and her collaborators were immediately met with racial hostility and were targeted by both white residents living nearby and white realtors who, as the article from the Chicago Defender notes, quote, "raised a clamor that property would decrease in value," end quote. As the article further notes, quote, "the property is adjacent to a fine new park about 5 miles north of the Jim Crow area of the 6th Ward," end quote, the Jim Crow area. Directly after their purchase, these realtors and residents organized meetings to prevent Lindsay and the others from building of homes in the all-white area and implemented restricted covenants surrounding the lots to contain the area and prevent the possibility for other Black residents to purchase property in the addition. Here you can see this area on one of our maps of the racial restrictions. Bernice Lindsay and the other investors bought that little rectangle, and covenants popped up around it. Next slide, please. These white supremacist mobilizations created delays in the building, but as we discovered through the analysis of city directories from the 1940s and 50s, eventually at least 14 Black families lived in the area, including Bernice Lindsay and several other Black activists and members of the NAACP. Here you can see how the covenants were included to divide the blocks where the families were living. So you see a covenant, that shaded area were the covenants. Lindsay went on to create the Carver Memorial's Home Prospect projects for Black veterans, this time building housing in the 6th Ward. The financing for the project came from none other than Columbia Savings and Loan, established by the Halyards. Next slide, please. These are just a few of many other examples demonstrating the Black Milwaukeeans' effort to overcome racial covenants in Milwaukee were multi-layered and strategic, taking many forms, including protests, establishing Black lending institutions and organizations, pursuit of open housing legislation, and individual attempts to buy or build homes. Indeed, the NAACP was closely tracking their efforts to move beyond the Sixth Ward or the so-called inner core. We discovered this list in their archives, documenting some of the 80 families who had pushed beyond the layers of boundaries and designed to keep them, quote, hemmed in, to draw from that Langston Hughes poem at the beginning of the presentation. One person in particular, next slide, that I wanted to point out is Zeddy Heiler, was the first person to own property and live in Wauwatosa. He had his white friend buy the land for him, and then the white friend sold it back to him, and he and his 6 brothers had to stay overnight with their rifles to protect their property after it was initially vandalized, but they were able to build the home, and it's still in the family to this day. I think his nephew is living in the home. Next slide. So I just want to, if you're very curious to know more about the effects of housing discrimination, I recently published a book, Struggle for the City, and which actually led me to this project and learning about housing covenants. So my book looks at the resistance to urban renewal in the 50s and 60s and how covenants helped to stop the fight for open housing. And my colleague Ann and I have a chapter in the other recently published book, Rhetorical Economies of Whiteness, where we analyze the language of these deeds. I mean, it's the legalese. You know, for those of you all who have bought houses, you know, the stack of papers, we don't read all of them, but when you look closely, it just, you know, your garage can only be here, your housing can be over here. You can't have cows and pigs, no colored or loud, and the driveway that is just incorporated to the point where it normalizes it. So we talk about that in that chapter. And Amber forced me to put in the next slide. I will be giving a talk at Boswell Books on November 19th, being asked questions by Joy Powers of, I think, Lake Effect, WUWM, and I'll be talking about the book. I will also be talking about the covenants as well. So next slide. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. Thank you for having us here today to talk about this wonderful project. And my email, which you can't see, and my colleague's email is at the bottom for anybody who's interested in volunteering for the project. But questions? Yes, sir.
If I were to buy a house and had these covenants in the deed, how many hoops do I have to jump through to get rid of them?
A lot of, I don't know how many hoops, but I think it's thousands of dollars. I think it's about, the problem with getting rid of them, and we don't want people to get rid of them, to be honest with you. Because it erases the history and we want to know where they are. But I know it costs money, and I think what is recently was passed within Wisconsin legislature, and I have to double check this, is where folks can put an addendum, you know, saying I'm aware and I denounce this language in this deed. But it's very difficult to remove that language for the deeds. And when I was giving a presentation at UW-Madison, someone told me that when they were buying their house, they actually saw that language in the deed. Yes, in the back, and then we'll come over here, sir. Oh, yes. Mm. Mm. Was that like part of the eugenics movement or was, right, okay. Yes, sir. Mm. Yes. Mm. 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 See, these are the stories that we're definitely interested in trying to capture. That I do want to to say that this is just these covenants and these deeds is just one aspect. There are so many other ways that discrimination was practiced, even to this day. We have one of my students who is from West Africa talked about the problem with trying to rent an apartment where his white friend was able to rent it and he could not. So this is just one way we're able to capture that. But you know, your story is something that we're definitely would love to hear more about. But that also reminds me of Lorraine Hansberry's wonderful play, A Raisin in the Sun, which talks directly about that as well. Yes, sir.
I think it's important to recognize this is not only a private sector thing, but this became part of government policy.
Yes.
When we were in Kansas City, we learned about J.C. Nicholas, who developed a lot of suburbs in Kansas, and his racial covenants were later adopted by the FHA, and so
Mm.
they became part of the federal loan program.
Yes.
GA and FHA and all that, so the government became complicit to
Very.
through its finances.
Yes, sir. Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, um, documents a lot of that complicity. And the other thing that you had mentioned too about the 1948, when covenants were deemed unenforceable, but they were still included, there was a thought process that that there was going to be a law or something passed that overturned what the Supreme Court had said it. So that's why this language was still showing up, because how can the government tell me who I can sell my house to or rent my house to, this privacy law? And none of this, it didn't become illegal to have this language until 1968 with the passing of the Fair Housing Law. I'm sorry, Terry, thanks for the name tag, I like that, and then we'll come over here. Yes. The ones that were flagged, I think it was about 20,000, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, this is maybe, we're coming up on year 3, because again, out of those 20,000, 5 different people were having to look at them and to verify it. Because, you know, if you just have one person or two person, you might get someone in there who wants to gum up the system, or, you know, so if there's any confusion, you have 5 different. I'm drawing from my Navy days, when you got those points of navigation, you got that intersections to see exactly where you are. You want to get it fine tuned, and but again, as Amber has also said, the project is actually the process, the discussion that we're having, and I've had my students do this, and they get to see their very own eyes. I'm teaching it this semester, and some of my students is like, this is not what we learned about in school. The South is bad and the North is good, right? That is the narrative. And when I've taught at other places, you know, in the South, they're like, you know, the South is good and the North is bad. So given this perspective is, it's eye-opening. So that's one of the reasons, that's a big reasons why we like this process as opposed to just trying to rely on computers or AI. Oops, sorry. Yes, ma'am. You know what? I'm going to say yes. I don't know if that will be picked up by us. It's important. I tell you what, the technology has gotten so much better since we began this. So now that even the OCR system, the AI system, is starting to pick up that language. So yes, so that might be a part of it down the line. So at some point is yes, we don't know when yet. It is a good project, but you'll be surprised how many students today can't read cursive. They don't teach it. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I was supposed to repeat the questions when they were being asked for the folks online. So the question was asked as to whether or not we'll be examining the handwritten documents. So that hasn't been decided to what capacity yet in the future. Yes. Right, right. You're absolutely right. So the comment was that we should consider videotaping when we collect in the stories. We're just now beginning that thought process of what it's going to look like, and possibly try to get a grant. We recently we passed the IRB approval to start conducting the interviews. I think, you know, because for a long time this project was just primarily 2 people, myself and Ann Bonds. Just the thought about that was just like mind blowing on top of our normal job. But with folks like Amber and some of our other graduate students, well, I think we're ready to tackle tackle that part. I didn't even think about video. I was just thinking maybe audio or like oral histories or something like that, but that's a very good point as well. Yes, 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 we do. In the back. Mm, mm. What was his name? Ossian Sweet from Detroit. His story might be interesting to look at. Okay, I'll take a look. Okay, I've never heard of him, but yes, Detroit was in Wayne County, notorious housing discrimination as well. Okay, thank you. George? Mm, oh, wow. Hmm. That's great. Oh, yes. Gentrification. Hmm. My my colleague and I were writing an article about the Halyards as well as Halyard Park and how that came to be. So it's a fascinating it's a fascinating story, and that makes me happy to hear that the church is investing in that. Okay, yes, sir. Leon, is that correct? Okay. Mm. Mm. Right, right, right. Yeah, right. Mm. Ap- Well, I mean, we see that problem with any large immigrant group who are coming into the community. There's a wonderful book about the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns, by Isabella Wilkerson, that talks about that. And there's a statistic in that book. Early in the 20th century, like 1911 or so, 80% of African Americans lived in rural areas, in the rural South. And that has essentially flip-flopped, by the end of the 70s to the urban north. my own parents were part of the Great Migration. My father was from outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and my mother was from North Carolina. And my father used to say, you know, when he at first went to Baltimore, he first went to Norfolk, then to Baltimore, and then the person in Baltimore said, if you can't make it in Pittsburgh, you can't make it anywhere. And that's where, you know, went to Pittsburgh and got a job in the steel mills and stuff. This was in the early 40s or so. So that Great Migration, yes, recruiting black folks, but also part of that is they were doing a lot of the jobs that, as my dad will call it, the hot jobs, the jobs that, you know, a lot of the white workers wouldn't do in the mill. So right next to the steel and the pouring of that hot heat and stuff. But you're right, there was a tract, and I'm not a historian, I'm not an urban historian or anything like that, but I do think some of those companies were using African Americans to like break up the unions to a certain extent as well. So you had some unions, you know, who were not necessarily a friend to the African American workers. Any other? Oh, are we done?
No, no.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, part of the anti-racism is, one of our goals is to help our congregation turn our beliefs into actions, right? So, it's one thing to understand this, it's another thing to do something about it. So, in the, often at there, so there are no scheduled trainings right now, but when there are trainings scheduled, I'll publish it, I'll make sure it's in the Chanticleer or the announcements or someplace.
We're open to coming, if you, we're open to doing one here if you like.
And we're hoping to get one of those trainings scheduled. Well,
Right.
we're hoping that they're done before February.
That's true.
But
That's
if
true.
they aren't, if the group
Yes.
isn't, then we're hoping to be able to schedule a training here. So that's about a 2-hour process?
Yes, well, yes. I mean, not about 90 minutes, but, you know, a lot of the information we just gave here is done there, but we'll take you step by step and also answering questions and stuff. So generally 90 minutes.
And so with that training, you, could become, what do I want to call them, transcribers?
We call them community scholars. I mean, this is a community engaged project. And so, like I said, we can do this information, belongs to the community. So citizen scholar, however you want to think of it, but this is a community project. And right now we've had over 6,000, I think, volunteers, including one, St. Catherine University in Minneapolis is incorporated to their first year writing project. So that's why they may help take us over the threshold to completion, but it's a community engaged project.